Ladies and gentlemen, what I would like to invite you to do with me is to look at what Paul has correctly identified as a historical process, telling us something about, I believe, how we deal with our regional and multilateral trade issues in this part of the world. The history of the EPAs is a history about technical issues, about political developments, about personalities, very much. I think personalities count in lawmaking and negotiations very much. It is a history about how, on substance, on how we deal with regional and multilateral relationships and our integration into the global economy. So my invitation to you is, let's look at the EPAs, not so much as a particular technical manifestation of issues around trade. They are there, we'll mention them quickly. But it's also in the spirit of what we started doing since yesterday morning when we had our keynote speaker, who gave us a wonderful historical and philosophical reminder of the bigger picture, of the African bigger picture. And that picture is mutating, that picture is changing, that picture has to change as a result of new dynamics. The point which I made yesterday when I shared this platform the first time was that things have changed in many, many ways since the days of the Pan-Africanist debate inspired by Nkrumah, when, as we were told yesterday, there were no states. There were no states. And my point yesterday was this thing called the state, which came down on the African continent with a thunder, brought with it a whole new set of realities and practices, and I identified this notion of sovereignty yesterday. And we have all become keen followers of the notion of sovereignty, and we are using it and abusing it as we deal with our trade relations, our obligation to implement what we've agreed to. But that was yesterday's debate. Now, the EPAs. Technically, the EPAs, and I think, just linking on to a point made by Paul, the first time, Trudy, we had an annual conference on the EPAs was exactly 10 years ago, 2004, wasn't it? Or did we have one before? 2003. And I remember the Easter weekend of 2005 very vividly, because a delegation, at that point, the Easter weekend of 2004, a delegation from the SADC EPA group, and at that point, with a completely different membership compared to what we see today, was going to Brussels to submit certain proposals on how to restructure those negotiations and the membership. So there's a long history. May I also remind you that in those early days, there was a keenness in the air, and that the Caribbean countries, the CARIFORUM, they negotiated and concluded their complete EPA within that first phase, within 18 months, a year or so on. And there was some indications from their side, look at what we have achieved. What about you? Well, we couldn't show anything, and we still can't show anything, but maybe the conditions don't require that. We must show that type of evidence at least. So it's a long history. But very quickly, technically, the EPAs are important and remain important because of the multilateral legal and institutional context. The Cotonou chapter came to an end. The non-reciprocal trade preferences came to an end, and in the place of that had to come a WTO compatible regime. The rules of reciprocity of membership of the WTO required that. The only basis on which the non-reciprocal discriminatory preferences of Cotonou could be implemented for the time that they were implemented was because of the waiver granted by the WTO membership. That came to an end. And there was this deadline of 2007, December 2007, and I recall how during that time there was a lot of pressure on at least initialing or signing interim EPAs. Because let's be fair, the fact that the Cotonou chapter had come to an end, the legal basis, the waiver had expired by 2007, didn't disrupt the market access privileges of the ACP countries. Brussels continued to extend those on a unilateral basis. Now that has also come to an end. In October this year, as Trudy reminded us yesterday, the market access regulation will come to an end. And after that date, and that's an important legal and institutional consideration, something else has to be in place. So what could be in place after October? What could be in place is that we succeed with signing, concluding, which is a descriptive term, not a legal term. If we can conclude negotiations and the process of putting into place the various EPA agreements, then there will be a legal basis, a factual basis for continuing it. If it's not there, and if there are no indications that they will be there, then we're into the only available alternatives, which will be GSP and for LDCs, the everything but arms. But may I also remind you, those are not treaties, those are not agreements. They are unilateral grants. They change from time to time. They are not comprehensive. Namibia's sensitive exports to the EU are not there. Many goods are excluded, and they've got their own rules of origin. So it is not as if this unqualified nirvana awaits us with its wide open, generous lap to jump into. It's not there. In a less strict sense, also, those qualifications apply to everything but arms. I have heard discussions about provisional application of the EPAs. That idea has been tossed around from time to time. Provisional application is something which is provided for in, I think it's, I'm not 100% sure, but it can be checked. I think it's Article 25 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And that makes provision for implementing a legal document which is not yet finally enforced. There's some technicalities involved there. But provisional application is not something which can save the absence of sincere commitment to a negotiated outcome. It's a technical method for giving effect to something which is which needs that space, that time, and where the nature of the substance being regulated is such that disruption would be unfortunate. So we can park provisional application here and look at the technicalities, but that is not an alternative to the real thing, which is through the negotiations conclude an agreement. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how can we look at the EPAs as part of the narrative of our trade policies, trade negotiations, and integration policies and discourses amongst ourselves and with the rest of the world? Now, the one example that I want to mention in this regard is, and maybe you recall, that in the beginning, one of the most critical issues, one of the substantive issues about this part of the world, were most critical about the EPAs was this point that it was disrupting our own regional integration schemes. Those wonderful, neat, comprehensive, clear, lucid schemes that we have worked out for ourselves. And they're just waiting to be implemented, and everything is on course till we listened to Paul yesterday. But we were very, very concerned about the disruptive external influence of the EPAs on this. That point is not part of discussion anymore. I think our own in-house debates on saving our regional integration schemes occupy us too much to make this issue a priority. It has not gone away, and in particular it has not gone away in another form, and that was another important point of criticism and controversy, the regional MFN clauses. They are still on the agenda, but it seems to me that to a very, very large extent, that one has been resolved. I'll come back to the regional MFN, and I'll use the SADC EPA as an example just to show how that debate that point was resolved over time. Looking at the SADC EPA, it's unique. By the way, in your files, there are background notes on the SADC EPA, the ESA EPA, ECOWAS, and the EAC. Brief 4 pages, 3-4 pages each, but it's just a summary of issues and where we stand or do not stand. But for me, the SADC EPA is an interesting story, and actually a story with real and positive outcomes measured on certain scores. In the beginning, there was a big controversy about South Africa's membership. South Africa concluded its bilateral FTA with the EU. It came into force in 2000, the TDCA. Also controversial with respect to the SACU dimension. But at the beginning, there was a firm position from Brussels. You've got your own deal, Pretoria. Stay out of this particular SADC EPA. It's a different arrangement. You've got a WTO-compatible deal. We need another one with the other SADC countries. Now, another point to make here, the SADC EPA is not about SADC. The SADC member states negotiate, as we know, their EPAs in different configurations. In the ESA EPA, in the SADC EPA, some of them, others have opted for GSP and EBA and so on. So, and of course, Tanzania is in the EAC EPA. The membership, that configuration of the SADC EPA changed by now, and that happened after a relatively short period. South Africa is part and parcel of it. And it makes sense. It makes sense because of SACU. That was a positive development. For a long period of time, Tanzania refused to negotiate its EPA relationships with its other EAC members. You remember those? That is from the signs from Tanzania were, we are historically part of SADC, and SADC is more than trade, and that is where we will negotiate our EPA, our relationship with the EU. Now, this is to me a very interesting example of how our sui generis debate about regional integration and trade, which we heard from our keynote speaker yesterday, influenced many of our decisions. But what happened, there was a shift on this particular point. And the Tanzania now, or since many years, is part of the EAC EPA. What are the substantive issues? Well, at this point, the SADC EPA seems to me to be confronted with two issues, substantive issues only. Now, on this point, ladies and gentlemen, there are a number of you in the audience here. You have been involved in these negotiations. You know far better than I do what is going on and what the technical issues are. And Gerhad is here to explain to you that perennial issue of rules of origin. So let me just mention those things, and we can all participate and clarify and add, please. But in the SADC EPA, it seems to me, well, those are the reports, that the only two issues, outstanding issues, are agricultural safeguards and export taxes. The regional MFN matter has been resolved, it seems, after it was a tough one for some time, and the rules of origin, Gerhad told me yesterday morning, there are minor issues remaining on the agenda there. The two tough ones, export taxes, discussed yesterday by Trudy, and the special agricultural safeguards. The ESA EPA, Well, let's make another observation. Serena is here, and she can tell us what the position of Mozambique would be. But the SADC EPA, in terms of membership from our part, consists of SACU, the 5 SACU member states, Angola and Mozambique as negotiating parties. The indications now are that Angola will go for everything but arms. It is out. I don't know, and we can hear from those of you who do know what the indications are. The last time that I've seen these reports, they indicated that SACU and Mozambique are still working this deal out together, and that they will be the SADC member states. But we can discuss that later. The other interesting one, of course, is ESA. The first one that was, and up till now, the only one that was signed, consisting of, on our part, Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar, and Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe, of course, is a very interesting one. The head of state of that country is, I don't know, I wonder whether he had personally signed that agreement, because Zimbabwe is still a target of sanctions. And these sanctions are directed very much at individual people. But be it as it may, Zimbabwe is in the ESA EPA. And then we've got, for the purpose of our discussion, the ECOWAS and EPA and the EAC. Now, there are 2 houses divided. In the beginning of the year, there were very nice reports, enthusiastic reports about the ECOWAS EPA being on the brink of finalizing. We are clinching this deal. And now that has petered out. There are very, very strong indications from Nigeria that this EPA is not in their interest. They don't want it. What I read in the reports are that industrial development, loss of tariff revenue, the liberalization, the opening up of the domestic market in Nigeria, these goods coming in, the competition that it will mean for our own, that those are the arguments now being offered on why that can't go forward. It will have very detrimental consequences for Ghana and its exports if it's not clinched. But it's a house divided, and I want us to look at the implications of that for the continental FTA, for our own debate, for our Pan-Africanist solidarity. Do we need to display solidarity amongst ourselves when we negotiated trade deals for integrating our economies into the global economy, or is there an alternative? Now, it is very late in the day, after 11, 12 years, if that disunity is still dominating in a configuration like that. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, 1 or 2 words about technical issues. The regional MFN seems to be resolved. It is not an issue in ESA. It seems to be resolved in SADC and elsewhere, because only future preferential trade agreements involving those African parties to the EPAs, which will be concluded with the big international players. If the formula being identified there is used, it will mean that only China, India, United States, any others? I think Brazil maybe, Brazil, yes, Brazil. That only agreements with them, trade preferential agreements, will kick in the effects of multiplying, extending those privileges also to the EU. At one point, those privileges were, in the SADC debate, only about tariff and tariff-related, goods-related matters, customs procedures, etc. I think it's still limited to that. But Axel is here, he can help us on the clarification of that one. So the regional integration dilemma and the multilateral integration dilemma, which was posed by the EPAs in the beginning, seem to be, well, they have been overtaken by developments since these discussions were launched. So the world doesn't look in the year 2014 as it looked in the year 2002 or 3 when these negotiations were launched. The politics has changed, the personalities, the multilateral context. The Doha round petered out in July 2008. So there's a different dynamic, and I want to conclude with that observation. The inconclusive debate about whether to negotiate, sign, and ratify the EPAs is an indication of, in my book at least, an indication of an inconclusive debate in our own ranks about trade-related issues. Trade-related issues about becoming parties to binding legal instruments, in this case for conducting trade with our historically most important foreign trading partner. But it also is an indication of a debate which is incomplete about regional integration, and this is an area that I think we will have to watch carefully. If we start negotiating, and we will have a session after this, after the tea break, continental FTAs, etc., then the evidence indicates that there's still a lot of distance to be covered on substantive issues before typical rules-based trade arrangements will be the accepted and the basic norm. Now, there are also emotional and political matters around this debate. I don't want to go there in much detail, but I've heard and I've read that in recent joint discussions by African trade ministers, the points about, in particular, the export tax. The export tax creates a lot of emotion, it seems, and there seems to be a resolve, in particular, around West African support and broader African support for Nigeria not to accept that EPA. Sometimes I get the impression our solidarity is more effectively demonstrated in what we don't want to do than in what we want to do. But be that as it may, I've picked up in that context that we will improve the AGOA, we will trade more with ourselves in order to compensate for the consequences that may come about. While the Kenyans will have a hard job selling all those roses in Angola. The indications of some unease in Washington about AGOA and some candidates migrating from there are also there. AGOA is based on legislation. That's the legal basis. Legislation in the United States of America comes before an institution called Congress. And that is where lobbying and interest, also the organized interest of the agriculture and other sectors in the United States are very powerful. That's a very important trade avenue for us in Africa, but it is unique, it's sui generis. So, ladies and gentlemen, my instruction from Trudy and Paul was to introduce the topic, to give you a little bit about the reminder of the history, the technical issues, and as I've said, the technical issues can be grouped together as those around rules of origin still, export tax, regional MFN, impact on our own regional integration, and anything else? Yes, Jürgen, what else? Agricultural safeguards, that's it. Ladies and gentlemen, my invitation is, what does this debate tell us about the topic which our keynote speaker introduced yesterday morning, namely our history, our context, our philosophy with respect to regional integration and trade. Thank you.